and girls. Welcome to Storytime with Mrs. Cole. Today we're starting a new collection. We're going to be reading The Adventures of Peter Cottontail by Thornton W. Burgess. This is a little bit different. It's a chapter book, not a picture book this time. But I love chapter books because it lets your imagination run wild. You get to create the pictures in your head. So find a comfy spot, get a pillow, cuddle up, and get ready to hear all about the adventures of Peter Cottontail. Chapter 1. Peter Rabbit decides to change his name. Peter Rabbit, Peter Rabbit. I don't see what Mother Nature ever gave me such a common-sounding name as that for. People laugh at me, but if I had a fine-sounding name, they wouldn't laugh. Some folks say that a name doesn't amount to anything, but it does. If I should do some wonderful thing, nobody would think anything of it. No, sir, nobody would think anything of it at all just because, because it was done by Peter Rabbit. Peter was talking out loud, but he was talking to himself. He sat in the dear old briar patch with an ugly scowl upon his usually happy face. The sun was shining. The merry little breezes of Old Mother West Wind were dancing over the green meadows. The birds were singing, and happiness, the glad, joyous happiness of springtime, was everywhere but in Peter Rabbit's heart. There seemed to be no more room for anything but discontent, and such foolish discontent. Discontent with his name! And yet, do you know, there are lots of people just as foolish as Peter Rabbit. Well, what are you going on about it? The voice made Peter Rabbit jump and turn around hastily. There was Jimmy Skunk poking his head at the opening of Peter's private little paths. He was grinning, and Peter knew by that grin that Jimmy had heard what he had said. Peter didn't know what to say. He hung his head in a very shame-faced way. "You've got something to learn," said Jimmy Skunk. "What is it?" asked Peter. "It is just this," replied Jimmy. "There's nothing in a name except just what we choose to make it. It lies with us and no one else, how other folks shall take it. It's what we do and what we say and how we live each passing day that makes it big or makes it small, or even worse than none at all. A name just stands for what we are. It does what we choose to make it. And that's the way, the only way, that other folks will take it." Peter Rabbit made a face at Jimmy Skunk. "I don't like being preached to." "I'm not preaching. I'm just telling you what you ought to know without being told," replied Jimmy Skunk. "If you don't like your name, why don't you change it?" "What's that?" cried Peter sharply. "If you don't like your name, why don't you change it?" repeated Jimmy. Peter sat up, and the disagreeable frown that had left his face. I hadn't thought of that," he said slowly. "Do you suppose I could, Jimmy Skunk?" "Easiest thing in the world," replied Jimmy Skunk. "Just decide what name you would like, and then ask all your friends to call you by it." "I believe I will!" cried Peter Rabbit. "Well, let me know what it is when you've decided," said Jimmy as he started for home. And all the way up the crooked little path, Jimmy chuckled to himself as he thought of foolish Peter Rabbit trying to change his name. Chapter 2. Peter Finds a Name. Peter Rabbit had quite lost his appetite. When Peter forgets to eat, you may make up your mind that Peter has something very important to think about. At least he has something on his mind that he thinks is important. The fact is, Peter had made up his mind to change his name. He thought Peter Rabbit too common a name, but when he tried to think of a better one, he found that no name he could think of really pleased him any more. So he thought, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought. And the more he thought, the less appetite he had. Now Jimmy Skunk was the only one to whom Peter had told how discontented he was with his name, and it was Jimmy who had suggested to Peter that he change it. Jimmy thought it was a great joke, and he straightway passed the word along all the meadow and forest people that Peter was going to change his name. Everybody laughed and chuckled over the thought of Peter Rabbit's foolishness, and they planned to have a great deal of fun with Peter as soon as he should tell them his new name. He was sitting on the edge of the old briar patch one morning when old Mr. Buzzard passed by flying low. "Good morning, Brother Cottontail," said old Mr. Buzzard, with a twinkle in his eye. At first, Peter didn't understand that old Mr. Buzzard was speaking to him, and by the time he did, it was too late to reply, for old Mr. Buzzard was way, way up in the blue, blue sky. "Cottontail, Cottontail," Peter said to himself over and over and began to smile. Every time he said it, he liked it better. Cottontail, Peter Cottontail! How much better sounding is that than Peter Rabbit? That sounds as if I was really somebody. Yes, sir, that's the very name I want. Now, I must send word to all my friends, and hereafter I am no longer Peter Rabbit, but Peter Cottontail. Peter kicked up his heels in just the funny way he always does when he is pleased. Suddenly he remembered that such a fine, long, high-standing name as Peter Cottontail demanded dignity. So he stopped kicking up his heels and began to practice putting on airs. But first he called the Merry Little Breezes and told them about his change of name, and asked them to tell his friends that in the future he would not answer to the name of Peter Rabbit, but only to the name of Peter Cottontail. He was very grave and earnest and important as he explained it to Merry Little Breezes. The Merry Little Breezes kept their faces straight while he was talking, but as soon as they had left him to carry his message, they burst out laughing. It was such a joke! And they giggled as they delivered the message to each of his little forest and meadow people. Peter Rabbit's changed his name. In the future, without fail, you must call him, if you please, Mr. Peter Cottontail. While they were doing this, Peter was back in the old briar patch, practicing new airs and trying to look very high and mighty and important, as became one with such a fine-sounding name as Peter Cottontail. Chapter 3. There's nothing like the old name after all. Bobby Coon and Jimmy Skunk had their heads together. Now, when these two put their heads together, you may make up your mind that they are planning mischief. Yes, sir, there is sure to be mischief afoot when Bobby Coon and Jimmy Skunk put their heads together, as they were doing now. Had Peter seen them, he might not have felt so easy in his mind as he did. But Peter didn't see them. He was too much taken up with trying to look as important as his new name sounded. He was putting on airs and holding his head very high as he went down to the Smiling Pool to call on Jerry Muskrat. Whenever anyone called him by his old name, Peter pretended not to hear. He pretended that he had never heard that name and didn't know that he was being spoken to. Bobby Coon and Jimmy Skunk thought it was a great joke, and that they made up their minds that they would have some fun, that Peter Rabbit perhaps made him sound very foolish as he was. Yes, sir, they planned to teach Peter a lesson. Bobby Coon hurried away to find Reddy Fox and tell him that Peter had gone down to the Smiling Pool, and that if he hid beside the path, he might catch Peter on the way back. Jimmy Skunk hunted up Blacky the Crow and Sammy Jay and told them of his plan and what he wanted them to do to help. Of course they promised they would. Then they went to old Mr. Buzzard and told him. Old Mr. Buzzard grinned and promised that he would do his share. Then Bobby Coon and Jimmy Skunk hid where they could see all that would happen. Peter had reached the Smiling Pool and now sat on the bank admiring his own reflection in the water and talking to Jerry Muskrat. He had just told Jerry that when his old name was called out, he didn't hear it anymore, when along came Blacky the Crow. "Hello, Peter Rabbit! Just the fellow I am looking for. I have a very important message for you," shouted Blacky. Peter kept right on talking with Jerry Muskrat, just as if he didn't hear, although he was burning with curiosity to know what the message was. "I say, Peter Rabbit, are you deaf?" shouted Blacky the Crow. Jerry Muskrat looked up at Blacky and winked. "Peter Rabbit isn't here," he said. "This is Peter Cottontail." "Oh," said Blackie. "My message is for Peter Rabbit, and it's something he really ought to know. I'm sorry he isn't here." And with that, away flew Blackie the Crow, chuckling to himself. Peter looked quite uncomfortable as he felt, but of course he didn't say a word after boasting that he didn't hear people who called him Peter Rabbit. Pretty soon, along came Sammy Jay. Sammy seemed to be much excited. "Oh, Peter Rabbit, I'm so glad I found you," he cried. "I have some very important news for you." Peter had all he could do to sit still and pretend not to hear, but he did. "This is Peter Cottontail," said Jerry Muskrat, winking at Sammy Jay. "Oh," replied Sammy, "my news is for Peter Rabbit," and off he flew, chuckling to himself. Peter looked and felt more uncomfortable than ever. He bade Jerry Muskrat goodbye and started for the dear old briar patch to think things over. When he was halfway there, old Mr. Buzzard came sailing down out of the sky. "Brer Cottontail," he said, "if you see anything of Brer Rabbit, you can tell him that Brer Fox am hiding behind that big bunch of grass just ahead." Peter stopped short, and his heart gave a great leap. There, behind the clump of grass, was something red, sure enough. Peter didn't wait to see more. He started for a hiding place he knew of in the Green Forest as fast as he could go, and behind him raced Reddy Fox. As he ran, he heard Blacky Crow and Sammy Jay laughing, and then he knew that it was the news that they had for him. I guess Peter Rabbit is as good enough name after all," he panted. Chapter 4. Peter Rabbit Fools Jimmy Skunk. Peter Rabbit came hopping and skipping down the crooked little path. Uncle Billy Possum always calls him Brer Rabbit, but everybody else calls him Peter. Peter was feeling very fine that morning, very fine indeed. Every few minutes he jumped in the air and kicked his heels higher, just for fun. Presently he met Jimmy Skunk. Jimmy was on his way back from Farmer Brown's cornfield. There he had been helping Blacky the Crow get free from a snare. Jimmy was still tickling and laughing over the way that Blacky Crow had been caught. He had to tell Peter Rabbit all about it. Peter thought it was just as good joke as Jimmy, and the two trotted along side by side, planning how they would spread the news to all over Green Meadow that Blacky the Crow, who thinks himself so smart, had been caught. "That reminds me," said Jimmy Skunk suddenly. "I haven't had my breakfast yet. Have you seen any beetles this morning, Peter Rabbit?" Peter Rabbit stopped and scratched his long left ear with his hind left foot. "Now that you speak of it, seems to me I did," said Peter Rabbit. "Where?" asked Jimmy Skunk eagerly. Peter pretended to think very hard. Seems to me that it was back at the top of the crooked little path up the hill," said Peter. "I think I'll go look for them at once," replied Jimmy. "All right," replied Peter. "I'll show you the way." So up the crooked little path hopped Peter Rabbit, and right behind him trotted Jimmy Skunk. By and by they came to an old pine stump. Peter Rabbit stopped, and he put his hand on his lips. "Hush," whispered Peter. "I think there's a whole family of beetles on the other side of this stump. You creep around to the other side, and I'll creep around this side. When I thump the ground, you spring right up around and grab them before they can run away." So Jimmy Skunk crept around one side of the stump, and Peter Rabbit crept around the other side. Suddenly, Peter Rabbit thumped the ground hard twice. Jimmy Skunk was waiting and all ready to spring. When he heard those thumps, he sprang as quickly as he could, and what do you think happened? Why, Jimmy Skunk landed thump right on Reddy Fox, who was taking a sun nap on the other side of the pine stump. "Ha ha ha!" shouted Peter Rabbit, and started down the crooked little path as fast as his long legs could take him. Chapter 5. Reddy Fox Gets into Trouble. Reddy Fox, curled up behind the big pine stump, was dreaming of a coop full of chickens, where there were no Bowser the Hound to watch over them. Suddenly something landed on him with a thump and knocked all his breath out. For an instant it frightened Reddy so that he just shook and shook. Then he got his senses together and discovered that it was Jimmy Skunk who had jumped on him. Jimmy was very polite. He begged Reddy's pardon. He protested that it was all a mistake. He explained how Peter Rabbit had played a trick on them both, and how he himself was just looking for some beetles for breakfast. Now Reddy Fox is very quick-tempered, and as soon as he realized that he had been made a victim of a joke, he lost his temper completely. He glared at Jimmy Skunk. He was so angry that he stuttered. You did that on purpose, said Reddy Fox. No such thing, declared Jimmy Skunk. I tell you, it was a joke on the part of Peter Rabbit, and if you don't believe me, just look down there on the Green Meadows. Reddy Fox looked. There sat Peter, his hands on his hips, his long ears pointed straight up into the blue sky, and his mouth wide open as he laughed at the results of his joke. Reddy shook his fist. Ha ha ha! Shouted Peter Rabbit. Reddy Fox looked hard at Jimmy Skunk, but like all the other little meadow people and forest people, he had a very great respect for Jimmy Skunk. And though he would have liked to quarrel with Jimmy, he thought it wisest not to. Instead, he started after Peter Rabbit as fast as his legs could go. Now, Reddy can run very fast, and when Peter saw him coming, Peter knew that he would have to use his own long legs to be very best of his ability. Away he went across the Green Meadows. Jimmy Skunk, sitting on top of the hill, could see the white patch on the seat of Peter Rabbit's trousers bobbing this way and that way, and right behind him was Reddy Fox. Now Peter Rabbit could run fast enough to keep away from Reddy for a while. You remember that Peter's eyes are so placed that he can see behind him without turning his head. So he knew that Reddy Fox was getting too near. In and out among the bushes, along the edge of the Green Meadows, they dodged, and the more he ran, the angrier Reddy Fox grew. He paid no attention to where they were going. His whole thought was of catching Peter Rabbit. Now, when Peter began to grow tired, he began to work over towards Farmer Brown's cornfield, where he knew that Farmer Brown's boy was hiding with Bowser the Hound. Dodging this way and that way, Peter worked over to the fence corner, where Jimmy Skunk had watched Blacky the Crow get caught in a snare. He let Reddy almost catch him, and then he dodged out into the open cornfield, and Reddy, of course, followed him. Bow wow 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 wow! Reddy did not need to turn to know what had happened. Bowser the Hound had seen him and was after him. Peter had just ducked in behind a big bunch of grass and sat down to catch his breath, while Reddy started off as fast as he could go, with Bowser the Hound behind him. So that's the end of our session for today. Please tune in next time for Chapter 6. I hope you like it.